Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us. We're continuing our series, Building a Communist Party, Past Attempts and Future Prospects. Tonight, we're looking at the Communist Party of Marx and Engels, and I'm very glad that we've got with us Marc Mulholland, who's a historian from the Oxford University. Thank you for joining us, Marc. Over to you.
Thanks, Tina. Thank comrades. So I hope to speak for about 45 minutes or so. And just to begin by saying something about the kind of contextual background of what political parties looked like in the 18th and early 19th century. I mean, if you look at, say, England in the 18th century, politics is based around the Whigs, who are oligarchs, extremely rich aristocrats, the Tories, representing more the squirearchy, and less remarked upon but significant, the crowd. So Henry Fielding, who is the chief magistrate at Bow Street in London, wrote in 1752 that it may seem strange that none of our political writers in the English Constitution should take any notice of any more than the three estates, namely King, Lords and Commons, all entirely passing by in silence that very large and powerful body which form the fourth estate in this community, and have been long dignified and distinguished by the name of the mob. The mob, mobile vulgus, which means the fickle crowd. It was kind of recognized as an aspect of politics in the 18th century. They would turn out in elections and they'd make their opinions very clear, and they'd riot over food prices or over political issues. Quite often they were mobilized by politicians in order to intimidate and harass the other side. But in a very undemocratic political system, there was this democratic element to it in the form of popular mobilization. There's another form of mobilization we see in the 18th century, very notable in Ireland, which is the politics of volunteering. That is the right that Protestants have under the Constitution in order to arm themselves in defence of the realm as volunteers. So they arm themselves, put on uniforms, march about the place, drill, but they remain citizens. They remain civilians in military clothing with carrying weapons. When the volunteers are established in Ireland in response to a French invasion scare, after the scare has faded away, they remain embodied and they march around, becoming increasingly patriotic in favour of the legislative independence of Ireland, and indeed ultimately begin opening their ranks even to Catholics. Marx wrote about the volunteers and what he observed about them. He took notes on Irish history, and what he observed about the volunteers, he paid a lot of attention to them, was that the armed volunteers, he says at a certain point, had now assumed a deliberative capacity. They paraded as soldiers and debated as citizens. So Marx is pointing out something which he'd recur to in different circumstances, but the arming of the people and a people who retain the rights of citizenship, notably the rights to politically debate issues and to take positions on political issues, is a fundamental requirement of truly democratic politics. The armed people is a necessity, I think, in Marxian thinking, but actually a necessity in liberal thinking in the 18th and early 19th century as a vital component of a free society. When you look at the French Revolution, we are seeing, amongst other things, the politics of the clubs. These are people who get together, held together by strong political conviction, and operate often quite locally focused. And if the movement spreads, they spread as a network of clubs, quite autonomous clubs in different, usually urban environments. So we can think of the Jacobin clubs, the Girondin clubs. The other aspect of radical politics in the French Revolution is the commune, which is just another term for local government, particularly the local government of Paris, which during the revolutionary years is, for a period, in effect, taken over by the popular masses of Paris, the sans-culottes, and becomes a focus of administration, political debate, and political mobilization. So the Great Revolution sees clubs, sees commune. When you get to the politics of the Restoration, by 1815, Napoleon's been defeated. The old order, to a greater or lesser extent, has been restored. And the counter-revolutionary states of Europe, the great powers, ally together in what's sometimes referred to as Congress system, sometimes referred to as Holy Alliance, which is an explicitly counter-revolutionary international. They're very clear about that this is their primary reason for alliance is to prevent revolution, and they will pool resources in order to suppress revolution wherever it springs up. So you have a counter-revolutionary international really before you ever have a revolutionary international, but there is a kind of incipient revolutionary international which is springing up or surviving through the early years of the post-Napoleonic Restoration in Europe. Various organizations like the Burschenschaften in Germany, the Charbonnerie in France, Carbonari in Italy. These terms just mean charcoal burners, but what these were groups, were networks, were social/political linkages on the underground, which tended to be radical, liberal, nationalist, democratic to a lesser extent, and revolutionary. Exactly how much scope they certainly existed. How big they were, or what kind of support they would have enjoyed at any point in time is difficult to say because they were underground. A lot of the evidence we rely upon are coming from secret police who have, under certain conditions, will play down the opposition, and other conditions will play it up. But it's real, and these networks of revolutionaries do exist in the first decades of the 19th century. At a certain point, sometimes people refer to young Europe. So young Europe is a kind of overarching term for the revolutionary underground. We can see in some respects a significant leap in political organization in Ireland in the 1820s. With the establishment or re-establishment in 1824 of the Catholic Association. This is a campaign led by a guy called Daniel O'Connell, which was in favour of Catholics being able to sit in Parliament, because United Kingdom Parliament at that time, he had to be Protestant to sit in it. Really, the Catholic Association is much broader than that. At a minimum, it's a broad civil rights movement. And it's always got a very large tendency towards increased national independence for Ireland. That'll become explicit later on. In a way, what's significant about the Catholic Association is when it introduces a cheap membership fee. A historian, R.B. McDowell, a conservative historian, but very good historian of Ireland, he remarks about the now well-known fact that the payment of a subscription often encourages people to identify themselves with the organisation demanding it, a kind of psychological feature. So if you're well off, you pay a couple of pounds to be a member of the Catholic Association. But if you're a peasant, you can join by paying a penny. And the very act of association, through making a small contribution to this organisation, first of all, gives the Catholic Association money to do things, but probably more fundamentally, it gives people a sense of association, a sense of ownership of that organisation. And then the organisation itself, spirals and spirals into a mass organisation. And we see what you might call, what's sometimes called by historians, the politics of the platform, which is the politics of the mass meeting. And there really are enormous meetings in Ireland in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. By the 1840s, we are talking about the term used for these mass meetings of what has now become the Repeal Association, are monster meetings, and they are enormous. People say that there's 1 million at a meeting. That's no doubt an exaggeration. But the way they used to have people doing public speaking would be some guy would do a speech from a platform, and he'd bellow out his inspirational words, and a guy who'd be far back in the crowd, he'd listen to the words, and then he'd bellow the words back to the people behind him. And this would happen 2 or 3 times, just so the entire crowd could hear what was being said. At a time, you don't have amplification, you don't have microphones or anything. So really large demonstrations, really elaborated organization on the ground. And what we have here is a more or less legal movement, but one which has always got the threat of illegality, the threat of revolution behind it. And this is really what's kind of striking about this form of mass politics, platform politics. Daniel O'Connell, its leader, is always talking about his respect for law and order, but he's also always saying, I don't know how long I can control these guys behind me. You better do what we want, otherwise you might have a revolution. So it's the combination of constitutionalism and revolution in this movement. The Catholic Association is very influential as a model across Europe. Flora Tristan, when she's coming up with a program for trying to develop a workers' movement, she models it explicitly in the Catholic Association. She says that's what we should do. We should have a very small fee. We should have mass membership, that kind of thing. Chartism owes a lot to the Catholic Association. And indeed, Fergus O'Connor, who's the kind of principal leader of Chartism, himself had been a follower of Daniel O'Connell before he fell out with him. Chartism is, if you like, the politics of the League. Or in a way, we can describe Chartism as the League plus the friendly association of trade unions, minus money. Another league which Chartists are competing with is the Anti-Corn Law League. Anti-Corn Law League is a middle-class or a mass organisation which just raises buckets of money. They can raise £250,000, no problem, which is a ton of money in the 1840s. At the same time, the Chartists are raised £967. So the weakness of Chartism is they don't have much money. Never as effective as the Catholic Association had been in Ireland at actually raising money, which is the sinews of war. But we all know how difficult it is to raise money for organizational purposes. Other modes of organization at this time is what you might call the underground revolutionary group, or the society, as it's often referred to. The most famous of these is Auguste Blanqui's the Society of Seasons. Auguste Blanqui is a kind of socialist guy, more or less socialist. He's mostly interested in the technique of revolution, which is underground revolutionary organization, and a putsch which will inspire an uprising, and you have overnight your revolution. May 1839, he has a go. He summons 500 members of the Society of Seasons. They storm the Hotel de Ville in Paris, which is the traditional focal point for insurrection. Barricade fighting breaks out, but about 100 were killed, but it's suppressed. 300 rebels put on trial, 80% of them working class, but historians have worked out by just counting who was arrested. Now, part of the people who fight with Blanqui's insurrection is a group mostly of German workers known as League of the Just. The leaders of the League of the Just kind of flee, and they end up in London. There they set up the German Workers' Educational Association in 1840, which is a propaganda front for the League of the Just. German Workers' Educational Society lasts a very long time. It only closes down in 1917, by which time any organisation with German in the name obviously isn't terribly popular in London. So it lasts until from 1840 to 1917. In the 1840s, it's joined by all sorts. It's joined by Scandinavians, Dutch, Hungarians, Czechs, South Slavs. And 1845, it's got about 500 members. It takes the slogan, slightly hippy-dippy slogan of all men are brothers. For a while, it tries to keep its central leadership in Paris, but it moves it to London in 1846. couple of guys, Karl Schapper, Joseph Moll, are the main leaders. Their origins is kind of Blancist origin, which is you organize a small group and you kind of launch your putsch when you get the chance. Their politics is the politics of what you might call ethical socialism. It comes from a good heart, which is what makes you a socialist. Exposure to the relatively free political conditions of Britain, and more significantly again, the mass working class movement of the semi-legal Chartists, gradually pushes these German communists away from the methods of secret society conspiracy. And they are particularly encouraged in so doing when they bump into a couple of guys you will have heard of, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. 1847, under the influence of Marx and Engels, this League of the Just German Workers' Educational Society converts itself into the Communist League, formally abandoning this hankering after conspiracy. And they invite Marx and Engels to write a manifesto for this new organization. Kind of notoriously, Communist Manifesto is always described as a manifesto written by Marx and Engels, though everybody says, actually, Marx wrote the whole thing. But the reason it's Marx and Engels is because Engels wrote preliminary drafts, which then, as the clock was ticking, because Marx was really taking ages to do his work, Marx finally kind of knocked together into a manifesto. It is kind of interesting to look at the preliminary drafts that Engels wrote, because this is really about a party, how they conceive of the party. So 9th of June, 1847, Engels drafts, he comes up with a draft of a communist confession of faith. I think that language is not accidental. It's kind of written in a kind of catechizing manner, which is very common amongst these kinds of organizations. There's a rhetorical question, a rhetorical answer, question, answer, question, answer. It's the kind of language that working class people are very familiar with, because it's familiar from how they were educated by their priests or their vicars or whatever. The catechism is a standard way of learning and memorizing what you're supposed to believe in. So the original draft of the Communist Manifesto is drafted as a confession of faith. Lots of things in it. It's all, you can recognize what turns into the various parts of the manifesto. And I'll just pick out some of them. So one of these rhetorical questions is, do you intend to replace the existing social order by communism of property at one stroke? As you can tell, rhetorical question. The answer is no, we proceed gradually. The first fundamental condition is the political liberation of the proletariat through a democratic constitution, recognizably Chartist. The first measure is guaranteeing the subsistence of the proletariat by limiting private property in such a way that it gradually prepares the way for transformation into social property. How might you do that? Progressive taxation. The more wealth you have, the more you're taxed. Limitation of the rights of inheritance in favor of the state. Instead of your kids getting it, the state gets it, etc., etc. This is the draft, so he just leaves that in. Other measures, employing workers in national workshops and on national estates. So he's thinking about agricultural labour there, as well as a manufacturing labour. Also, very importantly, by educating all children at the expense of the state. So education comes into this importantly. Note there, not education by the state, but at the expense of the state. And all this is part of what's described in this Communist Confession of Faith as the period of transition. Anyway, this draft is put to one side. Marx, in the meantime, in September 47, he writes an article in a German newspaper about communism. He notes here that the role of the proletariat in the first instance, what the proletarian party should be pushing towards, is winning a constitution to get together with universal franchise, freedom of association, freedom of the press. These are all important things. To a degree, we have universal suffrage. We have quite limited freedom of association. We've got quite limited freedom of the press. also makes the point, which is an important point, the refusal of money is, in all parliamentary assemblies, the means by which the government is forced to yield to the majority. So there's still a reasonable confidence in parliamentarianism kind of works okay, because a government, a state, is dependent upon a parliament to come up with the cash it needs to run its everyday operations, to be effective, to be internationally competitive as a state operator. You need regular taxation. You'll get that through a parliament. If you get regular taxation, you can get loans in the money market and everything's good. So there's this a general theorization here that a state might find parliamentarianism a pain at times, but it'll find parliamentarianism beneficial, at least in the way Marx writes about it here. This means the state can be reasonably easily subordinated to the majority, so long as the majority have the vote in universal suffrage. Engels comes up with another draft in late October 47, the principles of communism, he calls it this time, moving away from the catechism thing, but still quite in this form. He makes a point here that if now in England or France the workers liberate themselves, this must lead to revolution in all other countries, which sooner or later will also bring about the liberation of the workers in those countries. He stresses, I think more so than the previous draft, a completely new organisation of society. That is what the ultimate outcome should be, in which industrial production is no longer directed by individual factory owners competing against each other, but by the whole of society according to a fixed plan and according to the needs of all, with the participation of all members of society. You do away with competition, you replace it with association. That's kind of what the end point is going to be. How do you get here? Well, you get here, first of all, by inaugurating a democratic constitution, and thereby, directly or indirectly, the political rule of the proletariat. Universal suffrage equals, sooner or later, the rule of the proletariat. We can see a bit of caution coming in here at this point, though, because it goes on to say, democracy would be quite useless to the proletariat if it were not immediately used in measures attacking private ownership and securing the means of subsistence of the proletariat. How do you do this? Gradual expropriation of landed proprietors, landlords, factory owners, railway and shipping magnates, partly through competition of state industry. So you set up state industries, which then outcompete private industry, partly through a direct expropriation. Though he does talk about compensation in assignats, which is basically state-issued bonds. There would be the organisation of labour or the employment of the proletarians on national estates, national workshops and national factories and workshops. This would put an end to competition among workers, and you would compel factory owners, so long as they still exist, to pay the same increased wages as the state. So this all amounts to the first radical onslaught upon private ownership. And Engels then says, having done this, and this is something Marx will recur to in the manifesto, the proletariat will see itself compelled to go further. Marx more or less says in the manifesto that as you undermine the capitalist economy, the more you undermine its internal workings, the more you kind of have to go further and further, and that's part of the game plan. But on the other hand, you can't just leap to a socialized economy in one go. Engels says industry carried on in common and according to plan by the whole of society presupposes something, and that is people of all round development capable of surveying the entire system of production, something which doesn't yet exist. This in turn requires doing away with the existing division of labour. What does that mean? It means industrial education. It means changing activity. It means, interestingly, he says here, common participation in common enjoyments. So it's not just a matter of doing different kinds of jobs. It means the merging of town and country. He says democratic socialists will be in favour of some of these transitional items, maybe even quite a lot of them. The difference with communists is they see these transitional measures as transitional and not ends in themselves. Okay. Now, just kind of pause for a bit. How is such a future state to be subordinated by society? Well, one way you can say is the state withers away. On the other hand, that may be playing with words. You're still going to be talking about some kind of national administration. Even if you decide it's not a state anymore, it's still a national administration. How do you make sure that this administration is subordinated to society as opposed to subordinating society? I'm not sure Marx and Engels ever worked this out, but I think there's a couple of things implied in what they say here and elsewhere. At least they're kind of wrestling with the idea. I just want to pause on that for a second. First of all, there's something you've already mentioned, the power of the purse. To put it another way, as Marx puts it, the refusal of money is, in all parliamentary assemblies, the means by which government is forced to yield to the majority. Okay, sounds all right. But I think they get more worry about this as time goes on, because actually relying upon parliamentarianism to raise taxation does imply maintaining economic stability in the order as it is, which implies in turn the maintenance, production and reproduction of class relations as they are, and handling capital gently, to put it mildly. It preserves, in the end, parliamentarianism, as I think Marx and Engels come to see rather more clearly, implies the preservation of capital. And indeed, the state can be implicated with the circuits of capitalist economy, even when you cut out parliament. The state, even an authoritarian state, in the end finds itself reliant upon a minimum of economic stability, a minimum of economic reproduction. Find themselves really quite reliant upon money markets and so on. And later on, Engels will rephrase this kind of optimistic line that the refusal of money in all parliamentary assemblies is the means by which the government is forced to yield to the majority. Engels, in the Prussian military question, rephrases this: the bourgeoisie's real power in the state consists only in the right to approve taxation. On the other hand, there are elements in these preliminaries to the Communist Manifesto and indeed the manifesto itself, which I think are interesting. On the one hand, I've already pointed to it, the requirement for people of all-round development capable of surveying the entire system of production. That is, and another way to think about this and to rephrase it, is that the economic functioning of society, which in the end is the source of state power or governmental power, increasingly becomes actually dependent upon free association. This sounds a bit happy-clappy, and insofar as it's not worked out, I think it is a bit happy-clappy in Marx and Engels, but there's kind of hints of how one might concretize this a bit. Quite a lot of it in Marx's unpublished materials, things like the Grundrisse and so on. But one thing Marx talks about is the collective laborer or collective worker, which is the power of association within a developing capitalist economy and a developing complicated economy, and in particular the power of science. So this does various things. Marx talks at a certain point about modern industry by its very nature necessitates variation of labour, fluency of function, universal mobility of the labourer. Secondly, general social knowledge becomes a direct force of production, and conditions of the process of international life come under the control of what Marx calls the general intellect. Now, that sounds very abstract. I think really what he's talking here about the increasing significance and importance of science in production. And he says elsewhere, capitalism calls to life all the powers of science and of nature, as of social combination and of social intercourse, in order to make the creation of wealth independent relatively of the labour time employed on it. So what are we getting at here? What we're getting at here is the importance of science. Now, in the economy, with the implication that a future governmental apparatus has to be increasingly respectful of the role of a scientifically organized and integrated economic basis. Why is this significant? Well, one way it's significant is to actually look at what's happened in the last 100 years or so. If we look at the first half of the 20th century, this is a period when it looks like totalitarianism is a pretty plausible way forward for state organization. When people talk about totalitarianism, they talk about all kinds of things, but they mostly mean the influence of state propaganda backed up by state coercion. That is the ability of the state to marshal a public opinion, terrorize opponents, rally up those who back the state. This can be very effective in terms of instilling on a very large scale the military virtues, and it can make a very good army, for example. So the Wehrmacht, soldier for soldier, could beat more or less anyone in the Second World War. Similarly, Japanese army is very good on a soldier by soldier basis. And all of this science is important, but kind of subordinated to that role of the state, which is regimentation in a kind of literal sense of organizing society in a kind of quasi-army fashion. After the fall of France, Churchill, in one of his, unquestionably rather magnificent broadcasts, he warns of that France having fallen, Britain standing alone, all the rest of it, that they stand at the edge of the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. So here science is the handmaiden of totalitarianism. What's kind of striking is that, not entirely straightforwardly, but to a large degree, the Allies win, not because they have better soldiers, but because they have a better economic mobilization. Significantly, they have a better application of science. Not least in Britain, the personal intervention of J.D. Bernal, who is both a very eminent scientist and a Marxist and a communist, who plays a big role in kind of scientific innovations during the Second World War. What you get coming out of the war, therefore, is a kind of sense that actually, if you're going to win a war, if you're going to compete in international relations, you kind of need to have science on your side. But there's implications arising from that. And one implication comes out very strongly if you look at the early Soviet Union, or the Soviet Union in the years after the Second World War. A huge controversy over this guy, Lysenko, who came up with kind of quasi-scientific arguments about how to increase agricultural productivity. Lysenkoism wasn't in the face of it, barmy actually, but it becomes pretty clear, A, that it doesn't work, B, that it's going against the developing trend of scientific knowledge about genetics. But Lysenko hangs on because the Stalinist regime likes him. Until finally Lysenko is binned. Why is he binned? Because the science is messing up the Soviet economy, which means in turn that the Soviet state is running the risk of falling behind. So what you get in the Soviet Union is an increasing space for freedom when it applies to, in particular, the hard sciences. Why? Because the state needs the hard sciences. Science needs a significant degree of freedom, the ability to try things and get them wrong, the ability to have real debates about what works and what doesn't work. It's partly why in the post-war period, if you look at sociologists, political scientists, and so on, the kind of over-determining theory we've kind of forgotten about now is actually modernization theory and convergence theory. The expectation that Western societies and communist societies, so-called, are likely actually to become more similar rather than less. Why? Because they'll both be converging on the same model of the military-industrial complex. And the military-industrial complex is largely defined about the resources invested in it, which can be termed scientific resources. But that in turn requires not a completely democratic society, but an open society. You need a decent amount of freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of thought, if you're going to allow science to develop. We tend to forget about convergence theory because communism collapsed, as we know. If we look at the 1990s and early 21st century, this kind of capitalist triumphalism, and George Bush Jr. going on about, well, China's going to end up liberal democratic capitalist regime like ourselves because, that's the way modernization goes. But in fact, China is a good example of a different kind of logic, which is the logic of the very considerable scientific freedom which is required for state success in the modern world. So China, in many respects, is not an open society, but in many respects is an open society, particularly in the terms of science. Okay, so why have I gone on about this? I think it's because you can find a kind of implication in Marx, So Marx is kind of straightforward when it comes to capitalism and a bourgeois society, which is open to the degree that the state needs the circuits of the market to operate. And this requires at least a degree of a freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of interchange for the bourgeoisie, just for capitalism to work. And then the proletariat can take hold of these freedoms and use it to its own end. But what happens when you have state ownership of the major means of production? Well, the risk is that structural reason for having an open society is just going to disappear. Because if the state is running society and everybody's employed by the state, even if you're not calling it a state, what's to prevent this becoming an ossified bureaucratic nightmare, which indeed does become in Russia in the 1930s. I think the implication, you see signs of it in Marx and Engels, is that a developing economy will increasingly be reliant upon science, the collective laborer, a complex integrated economy, even if this is a complex integrated economy, which is largely concentrated in the hands of the state. If that state is going to be continuing to be internationally competitive, it's going to have to allow such a society to be, at the very least, open. Because if it's not open, you get complete ossification, you get collapse. So I think for Marx, when he's talking about in the fragmented machinery and so on, at least there's an implication there that it's not just cheerful stuff about how in the morning we can philosophize and in the evening we can, grow flowers in the garden or whatever, that kind of humanist interpretation is valid enough, I think, for what Marx is talking about. But I think he's also groping towards an idea about how you can have a collectivized, socialized economy, which nonetheless does not give the state or a state-type structure overwhelming, suffocating dominance over society. Okay. To go back to where I was, I'll be pretty quick for the rest of this. How are we doing for time? Out of these kind of preliminaries that Engels was coming up with, we get, of course, the Communist Manifesto. I've talked about this before in more detail at various times, so really just want to say the Communist Manifesto has got an unstated element to it, which is the democratic demands of Chartism. You add on to that the specific demands in the Communist Manifesto, and it's very recognizable from Engels' preliminaries. That is the encroachment on bourgeois property, which to a certain degree becomes self-generating. So to quote the manifesto, the proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degrees all capital from the bourgeoisie, but by degrees. In the beginning, by means of despotic inroads in the rights of property and on the conditions of bourgeois production, by means of measures which therefore appear economically insufficient and untenable, but which in the course of the movement outstrip themselves, necessitate further inroads upon the old social order, and are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production. We can tell the Communist Manifesto is not an election manifesto because you're not likely to put in an election manifesto measures which appear economically insufficient and untenable, vote for us. But so the manifesto is more in a kind of explanatory document. Okay. Now, the manifesto comes out and most people ignore it because a European-wide revolution breaks out in 1848. Coming out of the 1848 revolutions, we see various kind of, I mean, to some degree, the Communist League just kind of stops operating for much of 1848 into 1849. Marx returning as an emigre from the politics of the revolution in Germany, goes back to London where he's going to stay for the rest of his life. Interestingly, begins associating with Blanquists, i.e., if you remember, the League of the Just, which becomes Communist League, initially had been a kind of adjunct of the Blanquist movement in France, these kind of putschists. Striking thing is that Marx is very critical of most people, but he's always got a soft spot for Blanqui. He kind of thinks Blanqui is all right, you know. I think it's because Blanqui is kind of serious about proletarian power, political power, and serious about how you might go about getting it. So in the end, Marx, disagrees with that kind of conspiratorial approach that Blanqui promotes. But he does like his attitude, he does like his spirit. And particularly, I think, in the couple of years or so after 1848, he likes the Blanquist conception, which he largely agrees with, that if you're talking about the seizure of power, you have to be tough-minded about how you exercise that power, particularly in the early stages of it. That'll be power as kind of class struggle. But as the prospect of immediate revolution diminished, we see other kind of aspects, not contradictory, but a different kind of sidelights on the Marxian conception of political organization. One way of looking at this, which I think is useful, is looking at Marx's really quite consistent commentary upon the trade union movement, particularly in the 1850s and the 1860s. The trade union movement is crucial from a very kind of basic point of view, that it prevents you simply becoming a vocal instrument and nothing more of the capitalists. Marx writes an article called The Value of Strikes in 1853, where he says, and he's talking about America, where this will be very meaningful, in a state of society founded on the antagonism of classes, if we want to accept slavery in fact, if we want to prevent slavery in fact as well as name, we must accept war. Like, it's a very good slogan to bear in mind, a peace, there is no peace, If you want peace in class relations, you find yourself driven down. And the ultimate outcome of that actually is slavery. In fact, and the only resistance to that is collective resistance. Ultimately, before it develops into something more political, we're talking about trade unionism, or more generally, combination. But Marx also points out in another reflection on trade unionism that in its merely economic action, capital is the stronger side. So insofar as the working class rely upon trade unionism, they're going to win local battles, they're going to feel better about themselves, they're going to maintain their dignity, they're going to slow up the offense of the bourgeoisie, but they'll be they'll lose in the middle to long run, Capital has got the advantage in the purely economic struggle. Therefore, you need to turn the trade union movement, the working class will spontaneously move to political action. Political action which will generalize local demands into something which can only be effectively applied through legislation. A preliminary condition without which all further attempts at improvement and emancipation must prove abortive is the limitation of the working day, 8-hour day. Why is this important? Because people need time off from slaving away at work. Nobody should be at their desk at, what time is it? 7:17 in the evening. They should be, actually, because what you need outside the working day is intellectual development, sociable intercourse, social and political action. This is a quote from Marx again. And I don't think we need to say one is more important fundamentally than the other. It is intellectual development. And Marx could be very sarcastic and derogatory about workers he came across, because he's sarcastic and derogatory about everybody. But he's got no no issues with the fact that the working class, like all people, are capable of intellectual and show and display and develop intellectual development. A sociable intercourse is important in itself, but also in developing our capacity for collective action, collective understanding, for individual self-realization, social and political action. And this is indicative, I think, the working day, in a way, is the main theme which comes out of Das Kapital. When Marx reads the introduction for German writers, he says, guys, when you're reading this, read the bit about the working day. That's really important. It's because he'd rather workers didn't have to work all day, but it's a necessity for developing the capacities of the class. Now, again, Marx says trade union activity will soon be carried over to the political field. It's ultimately necessary. And in fact, it always happens. It's not something which happens at a very kind of distant point. You can go through a very long period, and most of the time is that the day-to-day demands of the proletariat are being expressed politically, but expressed politically through class enemies, because that seems to be the shortest route. You go to the Liberals, you go to the Tories, you go through Starmer in the hope of getting something. It's a form of political action. It's always there, the drive to do that. What's important, of course, is that you need to stop going through your political and class enemies to do that. You need to go through yourself. And this is what another aspect, as Marx writes in 1859, which is really important about the trade union struggle, and something which is sometimes we're too polite to remember, but is important. Marx says, concentrated, conscious class hatred is the best guarantee for social upheaval. It is important to have an emotional aspect of despising your enemies, your class enemies, and despise the order that they uphold. This doesn't mean becoming demoralized and degraded into a kind of personalized hatred. And it's just reading through my notes again on Marx and Engels in the Trade Union Congress, and Marx at one point says, obviously, if some scabs take your job, you shouldn't beat them up. And I thought, well, that's a bit soft, Marx, and I still think that's a bit soft, Marx, actually. But it shows that what he's not arguing for is some kind of personalized hatred, but he is saying that actually a hatred of injustice is important. A hatred of your class enemy is important. As a class enemy, not as individuals necessarily. And also this combination, and he talks about combination, that's a general term for trade unionism, but actually it's wider than that. Combination is trade unionism. It's also cooperatives. It's also just people getting together, as they often did in the 19th century, into self-help classes and self-education classes. Anything which involves this associationism is combination. And Marx sees it as a necessary, not just a means towards politics, but a politics in itself. It is a measure for the conversion of subjects into fully fledged citizens. We are not citizens unless we get used to association. Now, 1864, the International Working Man's Association is set up. I'm not going to go into it now. I think maybe the discussion might talk about it a bit. But a lot of the debates there is, on the one hand, the critique of Lassalleanism, the Marx-Engels critique of Lassalleanism, that is this over-reliance upon the state to help you out, which means you end up being kind of soft to, let's say, the Bismarckian state. Also the critique of Bakunanism, which is hostile to narrow, boring trade unionism, hostile to better paid workers, and so on. And the real Marx Engels stress in the International Working Men's Association is not upon contriving a fully worked out socialist program, though they're supportive of every step in that direction. But the real premise is this should be a proletarian organization, and it should aim for political action, ultimately the assumption of political state power. So absolutely central to all of this is politics. Absolutely not central to this is the idea that the International Working Man's Association is something which is, radical on economic demands and kind of holds things back otherwise. It's about politics. It's about politics. It's about intervening into the political field as a political actor, having opinions on things like wars, having opinions on things like colonialism, having opinions on things like whatever legislation is coming up. It's that political action which is important. In some respects, having the association, having the courage and the confidence to develop those opinions in any particular kind of legislative or foreign policy or domestic policy issue as it arises is more important than getting it absolutely right. Marx and Engels themselves are, demonstrably wrong in certain positions they take on international or domestic issues. But in a way that's secondary to what their aim is. They're not saying that the point of the International Working Men's Association is to call everything correctly. The point of the International Working Men's Association is to have an explicitly proletarian class-oriented organization which intervenes politically, and in so doing develops its capacity for citizenship in the here and now, ultimately develops its capacity for the assumption of state power. Marx wrote the fourth report of the General Council. Even under the most favorable political conditions, all serious success of the proletariat depends upon an organization that unites and concentrates its forces. So there's the dialectic, the interaction between a serious organization of the proletariat, but a serious organization of the proletariat which is intervening in the actually existing political arrangements. In this sense, Marx again, International Working Men's Association has not been hatched by a sect or theory. It is the spontaneous growth of the proletarian movement. One can argue about that. Very little in history is ever genuinely spontaneous. But I think what that is kind of pushing towards is the idea that this arises out of the necessities of class struggle existence. But it's a rise because it intrudes, it represents the proletarian interest on the political field. And in fact, 1871, speaking specifically about England, Engels writes, the trade union movement has become more an obstacle to the general movement than an instrument of its progress. And this isn't, I think, a general rule that the trade union movement will always be sloughed off or always run to the rear of the movement. That isn't the case historically. Sometimes trade union organization is laggardly in the proletarian movement. Sometimes it's in the vanguard, and there's no general kind of stages rule about how it's going to be at any particular point in time. But I think what we can take from Engels is that there is a kind of, what you might have said in the old days of dialectical materialism, a qualitative leap when you go from trade unionism to political action. And indeed, trade unionism, even from the outset of the proletarian movement, but very much when you have political organization, is that it's not just the political voice of the trade union movement. It's not that kind of laborism in the classical sense. Marx writes, our aims should be comprehensive to include every form of working class activity. So it's the entirety of the proletarian social formation needs to be reflected in its political organization. But that political organization itself is political. This is the rejection of Bakuninalism. That is, it intervenes in the political stage. International Working Men's Association kind of fades and disappears. Marx's famous critique of the Gotha program, I just say again, kind of adverting to points I made earlier, Marx makes the important point here that absolutely significant, important role about how we progress society is overcoming the opposition of intellectual and physical labor. And I think this again adverts to the polytechnic worker, adverts to the collective laborer, and the point is trying to suggest earlier, and it's maybe no more than a suggestion, it's not worked out in Marx and Engels, but I guess it's rather more than simply kind of happy clappy stuff about how we should be fully rounded human beings. It's actually a movement towards the kind of social organization of economy which is proof against subordination against the state, by the state. You know, we need a way to be confident that the state society subordinates national political organization and not vice versa. Marx at times, does bash his head about this. One quote I'm going to end on, just because I find it interesting, and because I think it doesn't answer all questions. But I think I'm always worried, as I've said before in different fora, by this kind of, agreeably populist, but it worries me, this idea about make the rich pay, as a kind of standard far left kind of agitprop slogan. I worry about that because if you make the rich pay, you're actually making a very good argument for the continued existence of the rich. If they're going to pay for everything, then you want them to stay there, and that's a logic which tends to work out, Marx in 1850 says, in a revolution, taxation swollen to colossal proportions can be used as a form of attack against private property. But even then, it must be an incentive for new revolutionary measures or eventually bring about a reversion to the old bourgeois relations. And I think I should leave that there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, comrade. Loads in it. Really interesting in terms of the history and the political highlights of how Marx and Engels organized at that time. I do have a couple of questions for you. If comrades in the audience want to gather their thoughts as well, to ask questions, etc. Now we named this session the Communist Party of Marx and Engels. Of course, it didn't exist. There wasn't one, funnily enough. Although the German original is, of course, called Das Manifest der Kommunistischen Partei in Deutschland. I.e., they were going towards a communist party, probably similar in the same way we're trying to do it today, trying to organize the working class. I do wonder though, there's a famous passage in it. I did send it to you in the preparation for this. And I do want to ask you about this because I do think it is worth talking about. I'm going to share it on screen quickly. And this is a mistranslation. I've mentioned this a few times. So working in the Labour Party, which I'm sure a few of us have done in the last few years, well, not anymore after we've been expelled, but before that, that passage here that I'm just sharing, the communists do not form a separate party opposed to the other working class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. That's the translation, which was authenticated by Engels. So he said that's the correct translation, and that's been used around the Labour Party as a reason to say, well, basically we all have to just be in the Labour Party, don't form a communist party because the working class is in the Labour Party. And Hal Draper's done a fantastic job many years ago, but it's still, I think, really worthwhile. His travels, I think it's Adventures of the Communist Manifesto, brilliant book. I can only recommend it. And he's done a different translation that says the communists are not a special party vis-a-vis the other workers' parties. They have no interest about. How do you interpret this section? Can I ask you? And why do you think it's used still in a misleading way, if you know?
Well, I think it's to be a good thing for the general discussion, not least because it's trying to find my Adventures of the Communist Manifesto by Draper, and I couldn't find the bloody thing. I have read it in the past, and he is very good. I always loved Draper because he's so funny, So he's a fantastic writer. If you look at Marx and Engels talking about the International Working Men's Association disputations and so on, they do lay a lot of stress upon we don't want sex, we don't want people turning up with their shibboleths, we don't want this kind of thing, and there is an odd amount of minimalism actually, which is the aim of the International Working Men's Association is to have a proletarian kind of organization, which in turn will participate in political action, and they don't particularly say that you have to be a socialist even to go into that, I'm not sure the original interpretation is so radically off beam, actually. a um, I think they do put quite a lot of faith in a way which I think we'd be rather less inclined to do so about the more or less spontaneous development of a socialistic consciousness. If you look at, of course, there's a kind of interesting debate about this in the Second International, because the debate about can the Labour Party join the Second International, you know. And the argument which Kautsky puts forward, which Lenin agrees with, is yes, they can, because they argue for proletarian political action. Once you have a party doing that, such a party will spontaneously develop, will spontaneously evolve towards an anti-capitalist position, which in turn will spontaneously evolve towards a socialist position. I think that's not entirely unreasonable to root in Marx and Engels, actually. But I think it's something we need to be a lot more wary about now. I think Mike has said this in other fora, which I've kind of popped in and listened to, and the child has been not jumping in my head. You know, that there are plenty of versions of anti-capitalism out there which are not socialist, or maybe they're socialistic, but they're not desirable, you know. And I have a feeling, rather than kind of, my kind of feeling is that you can't entirely kind of retro reconfigure Marx and Engels to avoid that problem. You know, I think actually they do leave a door open to that, of a certain spontaneous stages development towards the correct position. And I think they do it for all kinds of good reasons, but I kind of think it's there, you know. But there'll be people who are much more familiar with the various, the original German of Marx and Engels, who will tell me I'm wrong in the discussion, and I'm very open to that.
You were talking about, you know, the happy clappy part of Marx and Engels, which I quite like it. It's the fisherman in the evening, etc., etc. But why do you think they? I mean, as you described, they're quite clear about this is about a transition, isn't it? It's about, we're describing the transition. It's we're not for nationalization, which is good to know, looking at some of the socialist parties around who call just for nationalization of whatever, how many hundred companies. Tax the rich is not going to do it either. But we're also not going to put forward a blueprint of what communism will look like. Why do you think they tried to avoid that? Did they not have it in mind, really? Or did they were they perhaps worried about making mistakes, you know, being proved wrong on that? Because that it's kind of missing a little bit, isn't it, when you're trying to explain to people what's communism? It's the free association of producers. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mean, from our perspective, their position is entirely inadequate. There's no way you can just say the future will take care of it, you know, because workers will say back to you, well, we saw that future and it was Stalinism, you know, and that wasn't much good, you know. And in that sense, actually, I think there is mileage in going back and looking at the utopian socialists, and going back and looking at Louis Blanc and all that kind of stuff, and going back and trying to work these things out a bit more, you know. I think now we can see, I can see where Marx and Engels are coming from, you know, because you know, to some extent, we've got a very developed program about how the future looks. It's a hostage to fortune. Even worse, it looks like the kind of thing which the great and the good might impose, you know. And this thing is a real threat in our day. I mean, there's nobody out there who is proposing to establish socialism by force of their wealth and their and their overweening economic and media power. But there are people out there, you know, Elon Musk, who he's talking about his own vision for society, who is able to say, I'm the richest man in the world, you know, and I control Twitter, or X as you must call it now, you know. I think one thing in constructing a kind of communist program now, I think actually a kind of door is opened for the construction of a program now, which is a radical, as it used to be called in the 1840s, social republicanism, you know. There's a very, very important democratic argument, which has become crystal clear, that you just cannot have these concentrations of wealth and power. without it being degrading to the citizenry, So I think in a way what Marx and Engels are worried about with these kind of programs about the future is that it's almost like saying this is how you should organize society, who is going to do it for us, and it's almost a kind of invitation to the great and good to sort things out for us. And they're so anxious to avoid that they just are not prepared to go down that path of how society should be organized. I mean, they do to a degree, they do talk about concentrating production in the hands of the state, and then the state will cease being a state and so on, But they really, really want to talk about the actually existing proletarian movement, and they just don't want to talk about anything which takes away from that. But I think it's absolutely the case now that we don't have that freedom to do that anymore, we have had a history they haven't had, and it'd be just impossible now to credibly go forward and not put forward some program to the future. Other things got easier for us in a very negative fashion. 30, 40 years ago, if you talked about a general plan for production on a world basis, you'd have just been asking people to start yakking at you about catallaxy and about the impossibilities of socialism and yada yada, Now all you need to say is, look, we're all going to fry if we don't do something about the world, about the environment, It's just common sense now to have some kind of sense of large scale planning, or else our children are going to have terrible lives, Maybe that's going to happen anyway. But it's very easy to make the argument now, actually, about planning.
Yeah.
Because you'd have to be mad to think. I mean, there's plenty of people who are mad, but you'd have to be mad to think that's not important, So I think these questions change from period to period, The question for me, it seems, is how do you talk about the transition, And in a way, the end will take care of itself. It's correct to say we can't be sure about the end, and we can be more sure about the end than we used to be, because you do have to say, look, we're going to have to take control of resources. We're going to have to stop taking stuff out of the ground. We're going to have to change the way we organize energy on a planetary basis. We're going to plan. There's no way around that. That's just what we're going to have to do. So we can be quite straightforward about that. The transition remains an issue. How do you prevent economic collapse, economic disruption? More importantly, how do you empower the citizen? But I think a door's swinging open for the left if you can take it. Because it's going to become very, very apparent very, very quickly that we live in a world where the veils have been stripped off, and we have plutocratic rule in the way that we have not seen in such an unabashed fashion since the Whigs in 18th century England. It's crazy, So I think very, very strongly at this point, the communist left makes an argument for radical democracy, not just because we need to, because actually, from a propaganda point of view, it's just spot on for the period.
Absolutely. Just one last question before I open the floor, and that is how we're gonna, organize in the transition and beyond. And I like that you outlined they didn't quite solve it, Marx and Engels, the collective decision making, the state, that relationship. How do we go from here to there? And there are various formulations throughout Marx and Engels. We just have to lob off the worst bits of the state. We can take it over to some degree. We have to smash it after the commune. Marx was going the other way, but probably because he was arguing against conservative forces. Then he went the other way again, arguing against anarchists, and saying we can take hold of it in some countries, but not in other countries, etc. And we've got the withering away of the state. How do you see the key task then with the smashing? As a communist, I think the state does need to be smashed, the existing state, but we also have to build our own form of collective decision making, which will look a bit like a state, won't it?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's been a bit fussy to say there won't be a state. It's like in some respects the state means something which is horrible, and what you'll have instead of it is it's not horrible, therefore not a state, but it'll look quite like a state. It'll be central coordinated decision making. The thing is, how do you subordinate that to society? You know, I mean, one element of it is about radical democracy for sure. You know, but in some respects, I think what's significant in Marx and Engels, and this has not been entirely original. I mean, a lot of this is in liberal thinking that you can have democracy, you can have non-democracy, but capitalism as a system kind of relies upon a fair degree of an open society, and it kind of does. And Marx and Engels are quite explicit about that. You know, capitalism can't really operate unless you have the freedom to associate, the freedom for the bourgeoisie to associate, the freedom for the bourgeoisie to exchange information, the freedom of the bourgeoisie to come to agreements which are not being dictated by the state. You know, it means there's a structural degree of openness and society which is very hard for the state to close down without the state becoming entirely incompetent, you know, entirely unable to punch its weight, you know. So it's not that capitalism requires democracy, it doesn't. But capitalism does require a kind of openness to a certain degree. I think what's kind of potentially interesting about Marx's notion of the collective laborer, Marx's notion of the general intellect, is that you can actually map and find another way to say that actually, if we do think about a state-like structure, which needs to retain a basic level of competent functioning, it will actually also require a certain amount of openness, you know, and that's the kind of foundational basis for which you can argue with a certain amount of confidence that you can actually think quite big about about social ownership and social planning without panicking over much about whether this will entirely close down an open society. Now, an open society is never quite the same as an entirely democratically articulated society, and that requires an active citizenry. It requires very practical things such as, you know, a state which, a press where you don't have the guy who owns it saying we're only going to have editorials, which are only going to have opinion pieces which are pro free market. You know, you need a basic kind of infrastructure, and that's all as a political demand. You know, but in the end, you need a structural you need a structural kind of backing to that, you know. And I think a problem for Marx and Engels, which they never really got their head around, is that actually capitalism, as it had developed in the late 19th century, early 20th century, didn't have that structural backing for an open society other than free markets. I think there's actually a contradiction there in the Marxian project at that time, the socialist project. The best guarantee for at least a vaguely open society in the late 19th, early 20th century, I think probably is the free market, you know. But I think that's no longer the case, because I think what Marx was vaguely anticipating was the development of a much more complicated economic articulation, which relies upon a great degree of personal autonomy and individuality and networking and exchange of information, you know. In that degree, if you're talking about an economy which is based upon heavy industry, it's not difficult to think about an economy based upon heavy industry, which is really quite authoritarian. But it is difficult to think about an economy which is based upon information exchange, which is based upon services, which can be completely closed down and authoritarian. You know, there's ways of doing it, but they're going to be very maladaptive ways of doing it, you know. So I think in that sense, we can say that the predictable evolution of the economy, and Marx in many respects did predict it, but it hadn't come into existence in his time, actually gives you a kind of backstop, which means that you can be confident that a future society will be open, even if there's a great degree of formal large-scale planning, even if there's a great degree of state or post-state ownership and so on. That doesn't answer the question entirely. On top of that, you need to build an active citizenry. You need to have a democratic articulation. But if all we rely upon is our energetic attachment to democracy, that's never enough. You need a structural basis for democracy. There's a very good liberal argument that the only structural basis which exists in the late 19th, early 20th century is the free market. I think actually that's quite a compelling argument. I think the argument is is actually no longer there. You know, the information economy in which we live, if it is to operate at all in a way which is supportive of state ambitions, needs to be an open society. And that makes the argument for socialism much easier.
And internationally organized, I think that's a crucial question now today as well, because we can't do it in one country. Ian, hi.
Good evening, comrades, and thank you, Mark, for an excellent presentation. I just wanted to make a couple of small points, really, ask more questions, really. The striking thing for me about Marx's relationship to the organizations that he was actively a member of is that he was actively a member of them during periods of revolutionary upheaval, and he didn't necessarily feel the need to keep them going come what may. So the Communist League, after the defeat of the revolutions of 1848, well, their partial success, but ultimate defeat, he didn't then just, well, we'll just keep the Communist League going come what may. And what, I mean, Engels, after returning from having been an active belligerent in the revolutions of 1848, started to write The Peasant War in Germany, which is a magnificent book, which I'd recommend to anybody. And Marx, by contrast, sort of settled down to his studies in political economy. Again, after the Paris Commune, effectively the kind of ebb tide of revolutionary consciousness meant that Marx and Engels didn't feel the need just to keep the International Working Men's Association going come what may, but effectively kicked it into the long grass by moving its headquarters to the United States. And so I always find that interesting. I mean, of course, the preamble to the International Working Men's Association is I've always taken very much to heart that the liberation of the working class is the act of the workers themselves. And so from that point of view, there is always this relationship between organization and the class coming into being. And he didn't necessarily feel the need to keep the organization going in the ebb tide of revolution. We're in a different position where we can see that capitalism is not only collapsing, but it's going to take an awful lot of us with it, and we have to be ready. We have to be prepared. The thing that's really striking for me about Marx and Engels, and of course Lenin and Trotsky as well, was of course Rosa Luxemburg. They weren't afraid to sit down and do the theory. And from that point of view, I just thought I'd ask a question really about this relationship between party and class and theory and praxis, because I think they're just so tied up with one another in all the great revolutionaries, and that's the thing that distinguishes them. It's the thing that makes them great revolutionaries, as opposed to opportunists or whatever else. That was it, really. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Do you want to answer that straight away, Marc, or shall I collect a couple of questions?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's worth saying about Marx is that he was always actually very politically active. I mean, one of the reasons it took so long to write Capital is he's writing these other books which we never read anymore. The book about the emigration, which is great fun, but it's completely of its time. It's just about the book in defense of the League of the Cologne Communists when they were on trial in Germany. He writes an entire book in their defense. He writes this mad book, which I've never read because it's too mad, about apparently how Russia had subverted British politicians in the 18th and early 19th century, which is kind of mostly nonsense, actually, But the thing about Marx, we tend to think that he takes himself out to the British Library and writes Capital. The reason he takes so long is because he's actually very politically active all the time, and there's been a bit of a kind of academization of Marx, and we forget that he's consistently political. When the International Working Men's Association, yeah, it's true, he kind of withdraws from it in effect. It continues to exist. The anarchists continue to run it, but he withdraws from it and all that. but he's totally busy with communard refugees. You know, he just spends a huge amount of work in making sure they don't starve. You know, so in some respects, I think he's more politically active than we think on a consistent basis. You know, he's also we tend to get a wrong impression of his political operations, partly because it's great for historians, great for us who got all his letters with Engels. But you kind of give a sense that's what he's like. It's actually not really. I mean, the way you write to a bloke mate is this kind of locker room stuff, you know. I got a book in my house, which is done by some Cold Warrior guy, which is a selection from Marx's letters, Marx and Engels' letters. And it's all the letters where they've been a bit racist, you know, and it's quite a thick book actually, you know, because they're always making jokes about guys, but you know, and they sound like dicks, to be honest, you know, but it's because it's locker room talk between 19th century guys. Marx's reputation, if you talk about anybody he meets in particular in the worker movement, they always say Engels, he's a bit up himself. Marx is great, you know, Marx is just great. Marx will always be interested in what you're saying. He'll always want to put himself out for you. He always wants to kind of help, you know. And so I think in a way, but I agree with you, Ian, you know, that he clearly does say at various points, what I'm going to do now is going to concentrate on the theoretical work. What's kind of interesting about him is how bad he is at doing that. You know, he'll say that, and then 2 months later, he's thrown himself into writing some polemical book that nobody now reads anymore because he sees it's necessary for the movement at the time, you know. So I think actually in his persona, he's always actually in the thick of it, you know, even when it's a smattering of people on the ground, you know. He's always in the thick of it, and we tend to forget that because we think he spent all that time concentrating in Capital. He would have written Capital much quicker if he hadn't been distracted by the struggle, but he never actually gives it up, you know. And some of it looks silly to us now because that's the nature of life, that's the nature of politics. Some of it doesn't, you know. Insofar as he does kind of go a bit non-political, it's maybe from about 1875 and so on, because he's an old man, you know. He takes a while to die. It's the truth, you know. And he loses puff about 1875. He dies quite young, Marx, you know. I think he just, the wind is going out of his sails. Will happen to us all eventually, I should think.
Happy thoughts.
Yeah.
Jeff, please.
Yeah. Thinking about tonight's meeting, I looked up a lengthy article that I wrote in the 90s discussing this question, dealing with the problems of the Workers' Revolutionary Party that older members here will recall. And I think, first of all, Marc made the point about associations and organizations generally being in the 18th and early 19th century very loose. And this is reflected in Marx's thinking. Some key features. First of all, the hostility to sectarianism and the constant attack on sects from Marx and later from Engels. Secondly, the highly democratic structure. Marx was not interested in details of structure that we've had discussions around this sort of group about exactly how a party is structured. Marx wasn't bothered. It just varied over time and in different circumstances. And it was always based on the movement of the class. And as Ian said, it was often quite temporary. These movements come and go. And I think we have to reflect that, and we have to reflect the fact that Rosa Luxemburg was far closer to Marx's thinking than Lenin ever was, far closer in her arguments about the kind of party and the kind of democratic system that was required. And I think we have to pay attention to Rosa in a way that we so often don't. As to the future, as I said when I spoke about Morris offered some very interesting ideas about the future. I am prepared to dust down that old paper and put it in a suitable place, which would fill out the details of what I've just been saying. So thanks very much.
Interesting.
Yeah. Do you want to reply to anything there, Mark?
I mean, I'd love to see that paper. You know, I think, yeah, party kind of still looks different. It's still evolutionary. I think one thing we tend to forget actually is that I know I'm an Irish historian primarily these days, so I'm inclined to say this, but we forget about you have the land war in Ireland, which is significant class struggle. It's a peasant class struggle, but it's a class struggle nonetheless. And it's led by the Land League and it's led by Parnell and people like that. You know, Parnell at a certain point says, you know, for any movement to be effective in Ireland, he says it has to combine various things. It has to combine constitutionalism and illegality. It'll work if it's legal and illegal. It'll work if it's got the revolutionary and as he defines it as non-revolutionary. I think this is a big impact actually the Second International. If you look at the Second International, they refer to Ireland quite a lot, you know, in the 1880s, 1890s as a kind of model for organization, you know. So I think the idea of organization is mobile. Like Monty Johnson for the Communist Party in Britain wrote an article, which is a good article actually many years ago now, about Marx and the attitude of the party. And he says, you know, we have to remember the notion of the party is quite different back then, you know. But the party moves on, as it were, you know, of what a party means. So there's particular specific proletarian aspects to party organization, but there's also wider societal aspects to party organization which need to be borne in mind. You know, building a proletarian party now takes into account social media in a way that was not intrinsic to the proletarian condition. It's intrinsic to the world we live in. You know, and so there's elements of that. You know, what a party involve, you know, moves on. And of course, in Marx uses the term party, uses it kind of loosely in the way that often we don't recognize, you know, the Marx party is often him and his mates, you know. But I do think that Marx actually is always in the thick of it. He's always actually much more than we tend to appreciate, lending his services to really quite a wide movement, which is go way beyond him and his pals throughout the period he's looking at. He's always intervening. But I'd love to see that piece you wrote. It'd be great. You should stick it online.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, and prepare a session for the Communist Culture Club. Thanks, Jeff. Peter, please. We can't hear you, Peter.
How's that?
That's better. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, though. Got so many mics going in on the screen. Yeah, I think you know, the point raised by Ian's quite a good one about Marx and the way that he tended not to kind of keep hold of, be active when the working class are not so active. And I think that's probably right. And you know, you're probably right too, Mark, to say that he has these, you know, individual interests that he keeps pursuing. He's political and practically active that way. But I think most of all, I was just reading something recently about why Marx took the time away after 1848 in the 1850s, when the working class struggle was subdued somewhat by then. That he was really interested in engaging, looking at science, you know, biological science, chemistry, in terms of nature. I suppose that fits into what you were saying before about the concern on the one, you know, there's two parallel things I get from your talk, and that is that the development of capitalism itself. So it develops pretty large institutions, it develops science in such a way as to integrate science and the technologies that science produces into the labour process, and amplifying the social power of labour, productive power of labour. And so, and then there's this dark thing that you spoke about now. Obviously, that has been would seem to mean that, well, if things get so large organisationally, and if what we can produce becomes much more broad-based and requiring quite a lot of technology, large factories and so on, that begin to dominate each individual industry, then that can lead to a kind of power greater than the working class maybe can deal with in one respect. And so this leads me to the other parallel, which I think implicit in your argument is, I don't know, because I wasn't sure whether you were saying throw your eggs in the basket of parliamentarianism, and I don't think it was that, or throw your eggs in the basket of the Commune, 1871, the way Marx looked at the Commune, how it worked, how it built cross-class alliance from the ground up, where workers were politically, and how maybe a party should be crafted out of that local circumstance rather than something separate, a party separate, coming in from the outside kind of thing. And I'm thinking that might be the only way, or at Marx's time, the only way to kind of avert the dangers he saw in large-scale technology, large-scale use of science and technology, and the greater militarism that could result from that, and the the social engineering programs that resulted from science, like eugenics, and ideas about totalitarianism, the science, the science of the bureaucracy, which Weber mentioned in his rational bureaucracy and law. So I suppose my point then is that, are you saying that we need to have and learn the lessons of history about dual power and about the lessons of the way working class mobilize in common interest, which is context bound, which is networked, which can maybe act as a counterweight to the that dark scenario that Marx painted? Are you saying that? And perhaps like when Marx wrote the Gotha program, the critique of the Gotha program, and Engels' later critique of the airfare program 20 years later, that they were seeing in this social democracy, the mass party, which is heavily involved in parliamentarianism, as a kind of like danger there of them slipping into this framework of the development of capitalism at the time, to put it that way, the way it was developing into this kind of massive social power, which combines science, technology, and labour. He often talked about technology in scientific terms, more physical science terms as well, about being a fusion of powers, of energies, that kind of thing. So is the message that we have to tussle with the fact that it's only the workers that can kind of mobilize themselves? It's the act of the working class to that's going to be important in resolving their situation and overcoming capitalism, and that can only happen when they're mobilized, and that we should take every advantage when they are mobilized to see what they're building and build a party around that, and not substitute ourselves for the class when there's no organizational form there, and think that we can act in Parliament as a kind of surrogate for that till something better happens. Particularly with what I've just said about the development of society. The other thing, I'll just finish on this, that I thought your comments on the only democratic forms that you could find in the late 19th century and early 20th century society was the free market, because as I see it, my understanding is that the free market had melted away under imperialism by then and war. And that we had, and based on your argument about the general intellect, because that's what I was talking about before, the general intellect is, but in kind of less abstract terms, then we don't have a market anymore. We have brute force, the brute force of imperialist power, of big organizations carving the world up and creating wars. So, maybe when Marx was writing, we had a window of opportunity before that process within capitalism really took off. And that's why maybe it was a bit vague and averse about which way to go. we go with the state is for the bourgeoisie, it'll suppress us in the end, it'll buy us off, it'll use all of its powers of communication to divide up the working class. And I think he hovered around this idea of the commune. And I think that's, the test of history has shown that to be quite an organic form that the working class spontaneously bring about. Not just worker councils, but the communal council activities across common areas, which bring together social organisations as well as workers, their factory units, and in a network, and just based on necessity to try to deal with the necessary threats that they face then. And you see this like right up from the Paris Commune, the 1905, 1917, 1920s, in Portugal, 1974, these emergent kind of organisations. And so, without being too dark about it, I wonder if we have missed the boat in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, you might miss the boat, but I prefer not to think that. Partly it's psychological. I've got a 4-year-old child, and the last thing you want to think is we're all doomed, because I've got a child. But I do kind of think there's an interesting bit in Kautsky where he says, and Lenin says something similar. He says, it'll be fine to organize a centralized command economy because basically the proletariat are used to being shouted at and told what to do by factory managers, and they were just into discipline, So it's the bourgeoisie who complain about not having individual freedom. Proletariat are great because they don't, And it's a very melancholy way to look at socialism, that the great thing about the proletariat is that they're a regimented army, But you can see where they're coming from at that time because that is the nature of production. And I think that's the kind of contradiction you see in Marx, actually. There is a contradiction in Marx that he's somebody who wants to see human liberation, but also somebody who sees before his eyes the regimentation and degradation of labor, I'm more optimistic now because I think if you look at the economy, the way it operates, and I think this is actually, you could see Marx struggling to it, but it is a struggle, It's an important document that Marx writes is as it's known, the fragment of machinery, which is kind of makes interesting points about the general intellect, interesting points about how science is displacing labor, but it's a fragment of the Grundrisse. And it only kind of pops up later, but it seems to me now that we actually have a backstop to an open society, which is if you're going to be an oppressive state and you're going to rely upon regimenting your society or ignoring the necessary interconnections which rely upon free association, you are going to decline as a society. And in a way it has not been seen quite before. I think the argument in favor of freedom, debate, experimentation, failure at experimentation, trying to do things better, all these things we should value as human values, actually rest more and more and more naturally with socialists who argue we need some kind of generalized planning and organization. It's very, very notable in the last 20, 30 years in a way, which is just not the case actually, even when I was younger in the 1980s, 1990s, just how anti-science the right is, they are anti-science now, I mean, it's evident in the comedy version with that guy, the Kennedy bloke who's in Trump's administration, who says, fluoride is industrial waste and yada, 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 and no matter about the particularities of one issue or another, it's an anti-science because capitalism actually can't accommodate science anymore. It literally can't accommodate science. It has to pretend things are not happening, which are happening, which is the heating up of the globe, So the argument is much on our side on the left, If you're going to be sensible about this stuff, you need some kind of socialized coordination to deal with issues. But it goes further than that. We have the nature of the economy now is not just in science. Science is maybe too narrow a term, It's science, it's services, it's we're not just bashing together big things made out of metal, you know. A lot of production now is about human relations. You know, it's about taking care of people who are knackered and old. It's about taking. It's a. I mean, it sounds. I'm always kind of averse to this because it sounds kind of hippie and liberal, you know. But there is an emotional economy now, which actually matters, you know. So I think what's happening, and you can find this being prefigured in Marx, is that we have a generalized general intellect, which is operative within society, which, if you close the shutters down on freedom, will just immediately seize up. And as long as you have something which looks like a state structure, that's disastrous for that state structure. That's what protects us from the idea that a planned economy, broadly speaking, necessarily means tyranny and dictatorship. I think the argument that planned economy inclines towards tyranny and dictatorship is actually quite compelling in the late 1930s, 20th century. I think the bourgeoisie have got quite good arguments back then. I think they've got quite weak arguments now. Because a state which is going to be at all effective in the modern world needs to have a backstop of what, who's a guy who talks about open society. You need an open society for it to operate at all, for it to be effective at all, you know, or else you're just going to fall behind massively, you know. But I'm not. I don't want to be excessively cheerful about this, because there's still quite a lot of. You can keep an open, because this is what Stalinism did, say, and to a degree what capitalism does now. You keep an open society for STEM, and it's closed down for everybody else. That's the risk we face, you know. STEM will be free. This hard sciences will be free. The rest of us won't be. And that, in a way, that's the most likely future we face, actually, you know. But what we can argue is that, in fact, you can't, the nature of a social economy, you can't just say, keep the hard sciences free and everybody else has to be told what to do, or everybody else has to be propagandized to death, you know. I think it's a very fundamental argument saying the structural basis for modernity, for an effective state structure, for an effective social organization, requires freedom and requires planning. And I'm not sure you could have even convincingly said that in the 1970s. But I think you say that now, and it's entirely convincing, you know, or can be made entirely convincing. So in the long run, I think the socialist prognosis, the communist prognosis, actually, is more convincing than it's ever been. In the long run. In the very short run, we have an enormous risk, an enormous propaganda opportunity. We have never in my lifetime seen the domination of oligarchs the way we see it now. And anybody who's got an ounce of self-respect must be horrified and disgusted by that. And that's our constituency.
The objective need for a communist party, an international movement, is certainly there. The subjective side, on the other hand, that's still a bit tricky, isn't it?
Yeah.
You need something to actually push it over, but we're trying, aren't we?
Yeah.
Hi, Steve. You're on.
Hi, Tina, and hi, Mark. Thank you for a very informative and interesting discussion and contribution. I'm one of these people. A few of us see ourselves as being Republican communists. That is to say, different from Stalinists and different from Trotskyists. And if we had Republican communists, we'd think of James Connolly. We might think of John McClain, for example, as a couple of examples historically. And Republican communists believe that we need a minimum program and a maximum program, maybe even others too, but the minimum program has to be for a democratic republic, and it's through the democratic republic the working class can come to power. But the maximum program, the communist program, I want to concentrate on a little bit today, because when you look at the Communist Manifesto, you really think that they're talking about national socialism. They're talking about communism in one country. I mean, it doesn't say that, but it's almost implicit. They're talking about measures that you could take in one country. Now, I think the Russian Revolution taught us that, you know, this idea of socialism in one country is a completely flawed idea. And I mean, Marx understood that capitalism was a world system, very much so in the Communist Manifesto, obviously. But I think that we've reached a stage now through globalization, this whole idea that capitalism is an international, global system. And it can't be really transformed in one country because every bit of it is part of a world system. And we can't cut ourselves off from the world system. It's like we cut our own arm off, but the arm will die and the rest of this body won't work very well without the arm. So we have a big problem. Now, what that means is, in a way, that communism, if we've got globalization, communism has to be a higher form of globalization than the globalization that capitalism has given us. Now, that means, therefore, that the communist program requires there to be an international party or a world party. And so I think that we have to emphasize that the communist maximum program has to link to building a party across the world. Now, as you've already said, the conditions for the kind of technologies and information technology that we've got today makes that incredibly more possible. You know, we can talk to people all around the world now in the way that we'd better get on a ship or something to go and see them if we did in days gone by. So I think that the capitalism has created a world in which a world communism is possible, but we need a world party, you know, and we need a party. And I believe the Fourth International is not that party. I think any more than the Third International was. In a certain sense, if we're going to talk about a communist party and a maximum program, we have to start thinking about it as a world party. We can't construct a communist party, therefore. We can construct a little bit, a component, but we can't construct a communist party in one country. And I think that's what history has also shown. You know, in a way, the RSDLP only became the Communist Party at the time they were in 1917, when they were on the way to creating the Third International, you know, an international party. And Lenin obviously was fighting all the time to build those international links. So I just want to come back to that time, that just to finish on this point, that the Communist Manifesto is still implicitly national, and its measures are implicitly national. And if we want to construct a communist, specifically communist program, it has to be a global program, because we have to address all the world problems that you mentioned, like global warming. These cannot be solved in one country. And many things cannot be solved in one country. That doesn't mean, and I'll go back to the Millennium Program, it doesn't mean that we can't do anything in one country. All right? I mean, we can do stuff in one country. We can fight for a democratic republic, more democratic than anything the bourgeoisie's done. You know, the Paris Commune showed us that as well. So we can do stuff in one country, but we can't solve the problems of the world in one country. And so communism must be fundamentally, and a communist party must be fundamentally, an international party.
Thanks, Steve. I reckon we could do both, but I think Marc, would you like to sum up perhaps when you're answering to Steve as well? That was the last contribution from the floor.
Well, yeah. So just in Steve's point, I agree. You know, it's the balance. You know, you have to have something which is meaningful in Portland and County Antrim, where I come from, which is a village of 2,000 people, as well as meaningful in the globe kind of thing. You know, in some respects, it means you have to have a kind of a broad perspective about what the global transformation means. In a way, that's easier than it's ever been, because you can just say it in a very negative sense. We don't all fry, you know. Clearly, we need an energy economy on a global scale, which is understandable to virtually anybody, even in that minimal phraseology. I think we're more aware. People have to be more aware of globalism than ever they've been before. But you also need something which is local and which is specific, and we have to be conscious that transformative, revolutionary change is not going to be instantaneous across the globe, obviously, you know. So I think we need to think a lot, and I still cudgel my brains about this. I'd like to see comrades think about this a lot more, about what the minimum program is actually. You know, it seems to be the minimum program is on what conditions would you take power? And that's the question. The conditions in which you take power can't be the end of capitalism in the globe. It's probably not even the end of capitalism in your nation state. It's about the disempowering of the capitalists. That's the minimum. How do you disempower the capitalists in a way which is not entirely disintegrative of social amenities from day one? You know, that's what we need to think about. It's funny, Marx and Engels do kind of get into that. You know, Marx at a certain point, he says, oh God, if you know, one thing you should do is a capital tax, would probably now call capital gains tax, you know. So Marx at some point says, yeah, actually, Adam Smith, Ricardo, all these people, they make a very good argument for single tax. And the single tax would be a capital tax. And what's good about that is that it covers your needs in this transitional period. It allows the economy to continue operating, but it's also transitional to something else. It's euthanasia of the capitalist, you know. So I think what we need to think about is not the extermination of the capitalist, but the euthanasia of the capitalist, and what a minimum program would say to do that. And what you could say to any comrade in any country in the world, you could say they'll have all kinds of stuff you'll have no clue about. And the idea that you have a common term which is laying down the line on the specifics of any national peculiarity is just bonkers, you know. You can't do that. But there should be a minimum. The minimum it's a very straightforward minimum. You end capitalism, that's the ultima ratio. Okay, fine. The real problem to work out is what's the minimum for the assumption of power? And that has to be something which is basically premised upon the way we'd argue it now, which is radical democracy, the radical disempowerment of the wealthy, the radical disempowerment of the capitalists. And that may involve a disruption to the economy, but it has to be an argument you can make in the street, you can make in the household and say, look, you know, if things are disrupted somewhat by the richest man in the world not being the second in command in the American government, then we'd accept that, you know. But you can't tell people things are going to just fall apart, you know. So we need to think about the minimum a minimum program, which is not the way the Marx and Engels tended to talk about. Actually, they always avoided that key issue. I think, you know, the way we should think about the minimum program is the minimum conditions in which we'll assume power. They talked about it in a much more ambivalent fashion, which was issues which arise spontaneously from the class struggle, you know, and that opened the door wide to reformism, opened the door wide to making capitalism kind of acceptable to people, you know. We should stop thinking in those terms and reconfigure the minimum program as what's the minimum conditions in which you assume power, even if, let's assume, you only assume power in one country for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years, you know. Even assume you lose power after those 1, 2, 5, 10 years, you know, what's the minimum basis in which you assume power? And I've got ideas about that, but I don't have settled ideas. But I think that's really what we need to be thinking about now. And it needs to be partly, as Marx and Engels talked about, the subsistence of the proletariat. We'd now rephrase that as the decent living of the proletariat. But the other aspect they always talked about, which was, does this strengthen us and weaken them? Is this unidirectional? And we'd need to go further than that. Does this cut them off at the feet? We need a minimum program which cuts them off at the feet. And that's what we need to be thinking about.
Thank you very much, Marc. Brilliant discussion. Thank you also for your contributions from the floor. This video will be online very soon, so you can watch it back because there was a lot in it, and you know, very, very good that it was. Next week, we'll be looking at the Lassallians, the Eisenachers, and the Gotha unification. We've already touched on that today. Mike McNair will be opening the discussion there. So thank you very much, Marc, and thanks to everybody for contributing. Good night.
It's been a pleasure, comrades. Thanks very much.